network that's now being internationalized and connecting with people all around the globe, given this current year and COVID-19. We've been able to essentially create a more diverse connection going on. So welcome to today, and hopefully you get something out of it in connecting with other academics and other people to discuss this this particular topic that's been time immemorial, or as some may say, some habits die hard. So we're thinking about drawing and it working across a range of different practices, from reportage and political commentary and journalism to education and knowledge transference and visualization, advertising and influence, and narrative forms of fiction and entertainment, in the way that we are starting to embed them within design and art education across the institution. What I would like to do is acknowledge and respect the Pambalong clan of the Awabakal people, the traditional custodians of the land in which this campus of the University of Newcastle is situated, and recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters and culture, paying our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognising that connection that we have within the institution, but also here in Australia as an important conversation to be having. So the Drawing Education Network has been established to critique, question and promote the role of drawing within design education, and this event seeks to connect global scholars in discussion and collaboration through drawing. My name's Dr. Ari Chan from the University of Newcastle, and you can throughout the day connect in with the Twitter account network_drawing, and you can also look at the live stream via dita.soci.org.au. This particular network was funded by a strategic network and pilots projects scheme established here within the Faculty of Education and Arts at the University of Newcastle, seeking to build sort of research teams and distinctive research areas as we move forward, and start thinking about the critical role that the creative industries has as we move into this new millennia. This is tied in with the Centre for Applied Chaos, or FAST Lab, our research hub here at the University of Newcastle and within the School of Creative Industry. Our Professor Mario Minichiello and Professor Paul Eggleston are the co-directors of this, and it's a collaborative hub in which we're trying to link in and think about how visualization in particular can help communicate research and collaborate with partners both internationally and nationally. Our funded team, you can see here, this is a team that submitted an application to get this network off the ground and operating and start to be able to connect with you. And I want to thank all the different members from this team in their expertise today in communicating and helping set up this new and virtual online collaboration through drawing. So the program of events today, we've got the session 1, which is the keynote by Associate Professor Stuart Medley from Edith Cowan University. And then we'll be moving straight into session 2 with an introduction from Professor Mario and a discussion between Stuart Medley and Alan Mail, and encouraging you to interact with the Q&A and chat functions, which will be moderated throughout the day. And then we'll be moving into our breakout sessions, in which you can choose which one you want to join. Those links are there via the website that I mentioned earlier. So thinking about drawing for illustration, drawing for animation, drawing for design, the creative arts, and they'll be facilitated as we come back to a plenary session. So those sessions will be facilitated by the following people, with you starting to think about how these particular topics might be really relevant to this particular format that we're looking at now. So welcome. You will need to remember to engage with Zoom via the password DITA if it's asking and requesting you when you join those Zoom sessions. So simply DITA, D-I-T-A, and you'll be able to get into whichever session that you like, and thinking about connecting with Aggie Studio and being able to use some form of tablet and digital drawing as we move forward. So we're going to begin and kick off quite shortly with our keynote from Stuart Medley. He's an associate professor of design at Edith Cowan University and has worked for many years as a professional illustrator and graphic designer. In his book, The Picture and Design, What Graphic Designers, Art Directors and Illustrators Should Know About Communicating with Pictures, is a great read and really important for how we think about visual communication into the future. And I first found it out of him from his illustrations in the book doing design research. So without further ado, I'm going to throw over to Associate Professor Stuart Medley. Thank you for joining us today as we talk about the future of drawing and unthinking drawing and undrawing thinking as your keynote title.
Thanks very much, Ari. It's great to be here. Good morning, all, and good midnight to Professor Alan Mail.
Yeah,
having a long day, I think. So I'll just get my screen happening here. Hopefully the technology is working for us. Okay, hopefully you can see that. So yeah, it's a very convoluted title to this talk. I blame Ari for half of it. He gave me the unthinking drawing prompt, which I took that to mean that as well as an intellectual exercise, drawing is a kind of a body felt dance with the paper and the pencil and the self, from Merleau-Ponty through Lakoff and Johnson, Charles Forceville, all those wonderful thinkers. And undrawing thinking is my addition to that, because what I want to talk about today is the idea that it's not just the drawing that matters, it's how we frame it, how we put the drawings together in a sequence and so on. So there's my subtitle, Visual Narrative Cures Sketch Inhibition. So Ari has prompted me to reflect on Lisa Thurlow's work on sketch inhibition. And my subtitle has a medical analogy, since we find ourselves somewhat cut off from each other today. So I thought I'd begin with this lovely Matisse. And I love this little quote, which may be apocryphal, that Alan Fletcher has put with it. And my real reason for including this here, even though it's kind of encapsulates part of what I believe about drawing, I've put this here because the next 3 slides are kind of death by PowerPoint. But I promise if you stay with me through those, it'll get back to the eye candy pretty quickly. So just to summarize, sketch inhibition, as Thurlow, Ford, Brooks, et al. Would have it, it's the problem that design students, creative industry students aren't drawing enough. And that's the lament of art and design schools and many in the design industry looking to hire our graduates. And these scholars and professionals argue for more drawing in university creative courses and in high school before that. So here's the taxonomy of drawing inhibitions according to Brooks. And this comes from Lisa Thurlow's recent PhD, which explores ways that these barriers to drawing can be broken down. So firstly, at the institutional level, so increased consultation between course developers and industry, raising the profile of sketching and drawing, increased rigor in recruitment processes. I think that's the only one I have a real problem with, but I won't get into that today. Education of drawing tutors and longitudinality, embedding sketching and drawing throughout the study years. And these are her recommendations at the studio or class level. So you can see across these 2 levels, it's a pretty comprehensive to-do list for people like us to possibly respond to and address. And I think overall it adds up to nothing short of culture change, at least for a creative industries award course. And it's at this studio level, I think, where most of us, if we have some agency about what goes into individual units or papers, whatever you call them in your institution, this is where most of us can contribute. And these are the recommendations, I guess, that I want to focus on today. So Thurlow's relatively non-partisan on exactly what to draw. And so I ponder if there's a kind of a panacea, a single focused approach that would fulfill most, if not all of the requirements that Thurlow lays out. And the reason I think there might actually be a panacea is because of two strong trends for drawing, one in the industry and another one in academic research. And both of these trends, it seems to me, are around narrative drawing. So creating graduates for the evolving industry on the one hand, and on the other, applying theory should both help to address this to-do list. So I'll ask this morning, what narrative drawing changes about drawing generally, and how might we teach it? And I'll touch on some research using comics, research into comics, and research as comics. And I'll explain that how we changed our course at Edith Cowan University to meet a changing industry, and very happily made a drawing culture in the process. So firstly, the creative industries. I guess it's pretty clear to most of us working in them that the professional contexts into which our graduates are entering has been changing pretty radically. So one very clear example is the massive growth in service design. So service design, in short, is about deliberately developing the parameters of interaction between a customer and a client service. And controlling these parameters is really important because the economic basis of industrialized nations has changed dramatically over the last couple of decades, from manufacturing to the provision of information and services. And services now typically represent somewhere between 60 and 70% of the GDP of most developed nations. And drawing is in growing demand to help to understand and explain these complex relationships between clients and their customers, and between and within communities. And there's a nice quote from Roderick Mills at Brighton University, which I like. He says, "Drawing has accessibility, and increasingly as it moves away from reproduction, it has the potential of storytelling beyond the image to act as a pedagogic tool and for social engagement, and to tell stories and narratives for varying communities." It seems to me that's what the DITA team is all about, which is the right direction, I think. Service design is a focus at Edith Cowan University, a very tiny department of 4 people, and became our focus about 7 years ago when we took on my colleague, Dr. Christopher Quay, and that changed things for the better for us. So these changes are being reflected not just in service design, but in other design disciplines, for example, marine architecture. So in my own practice as an illustrator, what I'm asked to do now has changed quite radically, and not through any clever ideas that I've had, but because of what my clients have been demanding. So one of my clients is Austal Ships, and once upon a time they would call on me for an artist's impression of their latest vessel design. Whereas now I have to do that for them as part of a portfolio of pictures showing the full context of a customer's journey on board a vessel. In other words, they feel they need a story to help fully explain the benefits of the designs and even the experience of a journey on board one of their designs to their vessel buyers in Japan or Hong Kong or wherever it may be. So it's been a very interesting and quite a fruitful development from my point of view. So I see these trends as harbingers of, on the one hand, what W.J.T. Mitchell and Barbara Stafford have called the visual turn. So a general shift in the way society makes and communicates knowledge, that it's trending clearly towards the visual. And on the other hand, what's been described as the narrative turn. So Clive Baldwin said in 2016, narrative has found a place in the sciences, the social sciences, in the professions, as well as academia, and in the popular mind. There doesn't seem to be any area into which narrative has not reached. So now we see narrative for law, risk management narratives, data storytelling, narrative science. These are all growing areas of professional practice and academic research. So Paul Ricoeur describes narrative as any configuration of events into a meaningful whole, which is a pretty broad definition. But you might notice, importantly, the definition is independent of mode of expression. So once upon a time, we might have thought of narrative as a written story or a spoken word story. And now it includes, obviously, a whole range of other registers. Andrea Stephan, Vera Kane, Jean Clandinin, among others, highlight the importance of thinking with stories rather than simply thinking about stories. And in fact, I think you could argue that the changing role of design as an input to decision-making rather than as an output as a product is a function of this newfound emphasis on narrative. So what does drawing narratively change about drawing generally, specifically in terms of what Thurlow is recommending? And how might it be taught? So my approach is to discuss the possibility of bringing these issues together. Thurlow's call for an increase in quantity of drawings and the expanding professional context for drawing and the increase in demand for non-fiction storytelling. These all seem to be pointing towards narrative drawing as a possible cure for sketch inhibition. And narrative drawing presents some special problems, and these problems create some really great opportunities for teaching and also for research. There's some seriously exciting gaps in visual narrative research, which I'll touch on later. So the first thing that occurs to me about drawing narratively, putting sequences of pictures together instead of drawing individual drawings, is that narrative drawing can put the lie to the idea that drawings are necessarily vague or more vague than words. And this is something I've seen for a long time in many places, even in design contexts where I think people should know better. You'll find the assumption that writing trumps drawing for clear, unambiguous communication. So Timothy Donaldson, in his book Shapes for Sounds, the history of the Latin alphabet, says that images always need to be explained with supporting text. More often, the real communicating is being done by the words. And Barbara Postema on narrative structure in comics says the words are there to disambiguate the pictures. But of course, words are often found in gangs with other words, and it's this context that gives the words clarity. Pictures are much more rarely found in gangs. They're ganged up on by words. But putting pictures together in narrative drawing can allow for this disambiguation that groups of words enjoy. There are common instances of pictures being clear and precise in this way. So instructional design for assembly kits like the Airfix example here, or IKEA furniture, or airline safety cards. None of these are supposed to be open to interpretation. And if they're done well, they're pretty clear. So here where the drawings are, as Thierry Gronstein puts it, visually and semantically overdetermined through their repetition, the meaning can be made very clear. just as words benefit from the context of the sentences and paragraphs they're couched in. So later I'll show you an example of a legally binding narrative drawing. And I don't think you can ask for more exacting context for pictures. So in a more emotive register, Sean Tan's The Arrival, which I think many of us will be familiar with, describes through pictures alone the difficulty with adapting to a new culture and acquiring a new language. And in fact, pictures may be used to disambiguate words. Barnard and Johnson demonstrated this back in the 1990s. And this is a day one kind of task that students can do. We get them to disambiguate a word, in this case, the word top, using pictures. And these are all contributions from different students to try and make that word more clear than it is by itself. So my sense is that we don't yet know what communication is possible through pictures, especially deliberate communication through pictures alone, because we haven't rigorously tested the boundaries of this. And I think living in an Anglophone culture where words are generally given more gravitas than pictures seems to make this doubly difficult. So thanks, Shakespeare. Thanks, Austen. Narrative drawing, I think, leads to thinking carefully about framing as a vital aspect of picture making and of visual meaning making. Narrative drawing enables communication of meaning through progression, inviting comparisons and spotting the difference. And for the artist, putting the emphasis on thinking more carefully about which moment to capture. As children's book author Diane Kimpton explains, her children's books are not short stories, they're long stories told short. So the emphasis there on thinking very carefully about what to put in each frame. So the chosen framing of the drawing may mean the difference between the interpretation of the drawing as a depiction of a noun. So perhaps here we're looking at the emotion of joy or elation. Or perhaps the depiction of a verb if we zoom in on part of that same drawing. Perhaps that just means simply to jump here or jumping. So in these cases, high fidelity drawing is not what conveys the meaning. A stick figure would do the trick if it were framed in these ways. And framing enables changes to meaning even when the drawing within that frame remains exactly the same. Even with abstractions like this one, framing can be the difference between, let's say, calm and overwhelmed. Framing enables changes to meaning even when the drawing remains the same. These drawings are at that mark-making level that Thurlow recommends to lower the stakes for sketching for students. Furthermore, there are many collaborative opportunities in framing these narratives. This example features high school student work. My colleague and I often go out and do roadshows to spruik our course to graduating high school students. So in this particular example, we prompted students to think about redesigning the cinema going experience. And what we get them to do is to work individually to try and picture the separate steps of that experience, a night at the cinema, and draw each step on its own individual post-it note. That's how you know this is service design, right? And then what we get them to do is to come together and look at where the experience overlaps. And in this little snippet that you see here, where the experiences overlapped between the students and they have pretty much the same experience, we have a single line of pictures. And where we have a kind of a plurality, it's very early in the morning here, of experience, we get this kind of double decker or triple decker or quadruple decker effect. So these are different experiences of the same moment. So at the far left there, how to book the tickets, for example, or how to organize to go out for the night. So narrative sketching allows for this plurality of views, and it allows for a speed and quantity of ideas, a kind of a idea farm, if you like, when you do this as group work. Many makers working in concert. And that leads to co-ownership and shared responsibility for the narrative, which is one of Thurlow's recommendations as well. So the story is what matters, and negotiating your version of events, your part in the sequence of events, these are the things that become important in narrative drawing rather than anyone's individual scratchings. And because industry demands around understanding through narrative are growing, there's also a growing number of some pretty first-rate prompts doing the rounds out there, such as Tom Wujek's Draw Toast, which I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with. In our design course, we use these prompts not as recipes to be followed, but departure points or things to be critical of, like could we improve on these already pretty strong ideas. So Wujek speaks of nodes and links in his process drawings, and of the number of these nodes and links required for clear communication of a process. So the nodes, that's the objects or the touch points along the journey or in the service or in the process. And these are always his chief focus. And in the examples he gives, the links are kind of relegated to arrows, directing the viewer's gaze and making the order of the process clear. But with an inquiring mindset, I think these links can become much richer than mere directional arrows. They can be almost like the verbs to explain how each node is related. So here I think the links become actions. Or they can become reactions. I really like this example. This is one of my students' ideas of how to prepare their evening meal. Kevin Henry, the product designer from the US, says narrative sketching gives us the opportunity to focus on the contexts of use of a product without the product having been designed as yet. And in fact, that designing the context of the use will obviously heavily influence the physical output of the finished product design. So the process of storytelling can help us make vital decisions about things which don't yet exist. Importantly, narrative drawing puts the emphasis on the entirety of the story, not the individual drawing as an end in itself. Thurlow identifies de-stressing the importance of individual drawings as a key to breaking sketch inhibition. To paraphrase, the problem is that students don't want to sketch to plan for a purpose. They want to go straight to the purpose and they want to get it right. And of course, in service design, the planning is the purpose. And even better, oftentimes that purpose requires that the final drawings remain sketchy. It's about the clarity of the idea more than it is about fidelity to any referent. To paraphrase Ernst Gombrich, drawings that function in the narrative rather than drawing things the way they actually appear. And it's the sketchiness which invites and elicits participant interaction, very often the key to improving the design of a service. Seymour Chapman says narrative structures are never totally complete. They always require some reader input. And of course, comics and storyboards, sketch narratives can be carefully modeled regarding what's left out to invite that input. This is some work we did with a group of different students, including some from the Department of Business and Law at my university. And I would say, as an aside, work with business and law students if you want to give your design students a confidence boost in the drawing department. Birgit Mager compares the drawing for service design to scores for music, which must allow for improvisation, input from the musicians or dancers who will interpret the score. A focus on the story is a focus on imparting meaning. The focus then is therefore on the audience. What's in it for them? What meaning will they take away from it? And what aspects are appropriate to include? How realistic should the drawings be? Should the beholder be able to identify individuals in your drawings? Or is this a sensitive research context where ethnicity, gender, age can all be deliberately obscured through the right choices in drawing? So each picture has a job to do, and students begin to realize that pictures have tasks. And this raises questions around whether the right pose and framing is chosen, and even the degree of visual realism. Each picture becomes about its role in something much bigger. Thinking about styles of depiction and degrees of fidelity for issues of appeal, identification, or deliberate de-identification in the case of research. Thinking about degrees of sketchiness to elicit engagement and feedback. Drawing becomes a set of strategies that can be learned rather than a talent you either have or don't have, which is absolutely central to Thurlow's thinking to manage sketch inhibition. So the aspect of visual narrative that keeps rearing its head is that the actual drawing is only one element of the visual communication. As soon as you separate a drawing from the next one by some device, a line or a gutter or a space or a panel, the composition becomes important. It takes on meaning. The positive and negative space becomes extra activated. The sense of movement is accentuated. And one thing, of course, that narrative drawing gets you to confront is the physicality of the medium you're working with in a way that individual drawings do to a lesser degree. You have to think about the all-at-onceness of the multi-panel page. What's going to strike the viewer overall to draw them in? And what do you withhold from the viewer for closer reading? Narrative drawing accentuates material constraints. Where physically do you place the next drawing on the page? What do you leave over for the next page? How do you reward the reader for turning the page? These are common considerations for comics artists, but in a design course that must cover a range of contexts and applications, this thinking can also be applied to basic packaging design. How can you turn these things into miniature narratives to make them that much more engaging? So now I want to move on to research using comics, into comics, and as comics, as we've experienced at our university through our tiny little course. So through rough sketches and modelling with cheap materials, again, Thurlow prescribes cheap materials and no stress venues for the drawings. Students begin to develop an appreciation of this spatial and material arrangement of visual narrative. What should be on the cover to speak about the story contained within? What can each page allow and afford for the author's argument? And so on. And in our course, we begin with low stakes opportunities for the students to develop visual narratives for clients. We take next steps by introducing students to other departments in the university and researchers from across disciplines. So several years ago, we proposed the Visualising Research Initiative to the university via the Graduate Research School, and they took up our offer with gusto. I think the results could be called drawing for the academy. Another symptom of the visual turn and the narrative turn, I think. It's not just industry that wants to understand itself and explain itself better visually, it's scholars. In this particular instance, this was our students working with graduate students in the journalism school. And this was a PhD project on the culture of surfing in Western Australia. One of the very rare occasions where close representation was adhered to in narrative drawing. The researcher wanted to be clearly identified in his own narrative, and the specifics of particular people and the surf culture of particular places was very important to this PhD dissertation, hence the high visual realism. Over time, these projects have attracted attention from across the university, and some of our students at the undergraduate level get their first paid commissions to work on research projects for PhD candidates or staff. In this case, this was a visual narrative to explain cybersecurity to the entire university staff and student body. And this is now the official document to broadcast that policy, and it's had an absolutely massive impact according to the cybersecurity and IT services people. Not surprising given that the previous document was just a link on the website. We've had many reprints of this volume, which has been very satisfying. And we're never short of clients from outside the university either. We do a lot of work for not-for-profits, as I'm sure many of you do. So this is work from one of our undergraduates, which has become the national model for the Cancer Council's UV meter. You might notice the little micro narratives underneath there. And our undergraduate students are involved in our own department's research. So this is research using comics. This is an early visual narrative input for an Aboriginal health project funded by the Department of Jobs, Tourism, Science and Innovation. And this very rough sketch sequence was absolutely central to us winning a $200,000 grant to do more rough sketching. So we're working with Aboriginal communities at the moment to help them develop their own visual health messages. The participants to the research will provide the visual narrative ideas and the drawings. As the wonderful catch cry goes with regards to Aboriginal data sovereignty, nothing about us without us, which I love. I want to see that on t-shirts. Our comics culture has begun to grow through this focus on narrative drawing. 4 years ago, we took on the Ledger Awards, which is the Australian National Comics Awards annual, as a design project for our undergraduates. And this was a very strategic way to become a kind of a hub for comics information and to be central to the publishing culture of Australian comics. So it seems that even our typographic design these days revolves around drawing. And 2 years ago, we decided we had enough critical mass to set up the Perth Comic Arts Festival, of which I am the chair. So here's the family shot following the first Australian Comics Symposium. And this focus on narrative has now made us the institutional home of comics in WA. The Perth Comic Arts Festival, or PCAF, now brings in more people to each annual event than the university's entire end-of-year graduate show. It has an associated research symposium whose outputs are a focus for comics scholarship in Australia. And we have a special edition coming up in the Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics. And PCAF is really the flagship of a supportive maker community, one in which I hope it's easy for newcomers to see that all sorts of styles and stories are legitimate, which we hope is kind of lowering drawing inhibition through a kind of a decentralization of the, where this knowledge comes from, I guess. Here's Robert Cook, the curator of Australian art at the State Gallery, launching the first PCAF comics exhibition. We have 2 associated exhibitions each year with the festival. So ultimately, as I said before, I think what Lisa Thurlow is angling for is a culture change around drawing, and I think the festival is a pretty clear indicator that we're starting to achieve that. Sorry, audio problem. Sorry about that. And all this has come about really from the beginning of just trying to change our own small design course to keep up with industry demand. And more importantly for PCAF, we've had a really huge buy-in from real communities of practice with passion indirectly proportional to their budgets, and people whose taxes help pay for our institutions, let's face it. So it's a great community of diverse, mostly young makers who want to and can tell their own narratives. And you can see a great diversity in styles too. And of course, we recruited many students through the festival when they realized they can come to study something about comics at a university level. Their eyes light up. And this growth in comics culture has connected us to other places of comics culture, including Newcastle now, which is great to know. Good to be a part of the nascent Den. We have, with PCAF, we have sister festivals, including the Lakes International Comic Art Festival in the UK, the Lyon BD Festival in France, and growing opportunities for study exchanges for our students, including with the University of Sassari in Sardinia, who we worked with on this particular project about refugees, post-war refugees in Italy. And the Perth Comics Art Festival has, of course, flushed out all the comics-friendly academics from my institution within other disciplines. And there are a few here and there, some in the health sciences, which is great to see, some in the arts, as you might expect, and my great friend and colleague here, Deborah Dudek, who works in the English department. So we've begun by trying to bring the school's disciplines together in first year. There's a range of what we call core units, and one of those is called storytelling and meaning. And a strategy that Deborah and I developed was to present a lecture as a conversation between a designer and a writer, both with a passion for comics, discussing our different but also shared views of this kind of storytelling and meaning making. And this is followed up by a module of tutes for the first years. So the subtext of our presentation and our tutorials is that all should draw and all should write. And we, in this particular discussion, I'll put it up here. I'll put a link on this, hopefully when this is up online and published. we can activate the link, and anybody that's interested can see this conversation between Deborah and myself. What we're really talking about is the differences in focalization, which, if you're not familiar, is a narratological concept. We're interested in the differences between writing and writing with text and writing with pictures around this idea of focalization, which in short is like who sees and who gets to be seen. So whose eyes are we seeing through when we read the narrative? I mentioned before some of the special research opportunities presented by narrative drawing. And I think for me, the one that's looking really exciting is around this idea of focalization. So this area, I think, is wide open. This is a piece that I've been working on with the Centre for Social Impact, who employs one of our graduates in service design. I'll just zoom in a bit on this if I can. So essentially what this is describing is a new service around homelessness. And what we have here is kind of color-coded journeys. This is a timeline reading from left to right, color-coded journeys of 3 different personas, de-identified personas based on real data, going through the service. So the yellow service is the yellow part of the service described here is the spine of it, the behind the scenes, and the blue is one persona that would access that service, and the kind of peach color is another. And what interests me from a research point of view here is that we've got 3 personas that the narrative is focalized through. So I'm very interested in how different readers come to this, reading 3 narratives concurrently for a start, but who they identify with and why. And one of the areas that's got a lot of potential, I think, in narratology for comics is around what they call unnatural narratives. So there's a whole bunch of discussion around what is an unnatural narrative. Comics get away with a lot because they're such a strange and lively medium anyway. But one example of an unnatural narrative is a second person narrative. So the author addressing the reader as you. And a lot of research in narratology around writing says that the you is more or less a substitute first person or third person. But I think in this case with service design narratives like this one, where they're visual and where the service is being offered to particular people, the people reading it have to take that you at face value. So it's as you can see from my mumbling, it's a very complex area to get to grips with. It gets even more complicated where the you being referred to is a kind of a legal understanding. So this to me is like one of the really exciting areas in narrative drawing is comics contracts. So it's a growing area of legal practice, comes under the umbrella of legal design, which once upon a time meant kind of better writing for understanding agreements, but now includes like literal graphic design and comic books as contracts, as worker contracts. So this is an example from the lawyer Robert DeRoy, based in Cape Town. This is his concept as visualized by this team, GenCom. Very visual, pretty self-explanatory. But here, this second person, you, being referred to, the person that's kind of being referred to here has to understand that when they read the comic, and they're signing up to something legally binding. So it's definitely not a substitute first person or substitute third person. It's a legally binding second person. So very complex area of narratology, and very rich pickings for those of us interested in visual narrative, I think. So I've been a consultant with lawyers over at the University of Western Australia, trying to help them make better comics contracts. And one of the interesting things for me working with the lawyers is that it throws into sharp relief some of the benefits I just described about narrative drawing. You really do realize that the ability to draw is just a small part of a greater whole with regards to clear communication. So one of the lawyers showed me some of their work using a program called Pixton. I'm not sure if you've seen this online. It's kind of an online comics making app. And the characters in there, you get a lot of ready-made characters, and they work a bit like paper dolls. You can kind of bend them around, move them into different poses. So it enables that raw skill, I suppose, of drawing individual drawings. But of course, what it can't do for you is decide how to frame the pictures, how to angle the drawing, how to focalize, basically, and ocularize the sequence of pictures. So with a range of digital comic making tools available online, lawyers intent on, shall we say, literally drawing up a contract can make their own comics. But before they begin, I think they really need to be aware of the conventions of comics and some of the rudiments of visual communication. And also, it's a very expensive way to make comics. I think we can do it for them more cheaply. I don't know many illustrators that get paid the same rate as lawyers do by the hour. This strong presence of comics at our institution has begun to attract research students of very strong caliber that are interested in visual narrative. At the moment, we have 3 doing research into comics and narrative drawing, including the Australian comics legend, Bruce Mutard. Bruce should have his PhD finished by the end of this year. Here's the cover he's designed for it. So he's getting close, and it's a really wonderful work. And I think finally, we really get a sense that we're making progress when our scholarship goes meta. So this finally is comics, research as comics. So we've looked at research using comics, research into comics. This is research as comics. So this is a piece I did with Helen Cara in the UK and Bruce Mutard, describing a day we did of sketchnoting of different comic scholars at the Lakes International Comics Art Festival in the UK, and looking at the disparate approaches to comics scholarship. But then we drew it up as a comic. So walking the talk, as they say. And this is on its way to being published in the Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics. And here's another piece that Bruce and I have done together about comics and the law, which is already published in the much more conservative Law Review of the University of Western Australia. So it seems professionals and academics and even the most conservative disciplines and practices are crying out for help with better ways of understanding and explaining themselves. and people like us should be poised and ready to help. And I think we can be if we focus on narrative drawing when we do focus on drawing. So 7 years ago, our department took on service design, and we were able to change our courses and our units, I guess because we're a small, very small department and we weren't stepping on too many toes. So I think it kind of shows the power of individuals, but only if, you know, scholars have some agency to translate their research focus, in my case on comics and in Chris's on service design, to translate that into teaching action. And that idea of agency is why I've focused on that studio level of Thurlow's recommendations. But I think a change even here can lead to real institutional change and cultural change around drawing in a course. But as I said before, the real panacea to boost your design students' drawing confidence is to get them to work with business and law students. And that's it from me this morning. Thanks for listening and watching, of course.
Thank you, Stuart, for a great sort of directional focus on how we can. Sorry, just got a bit of an audio problem. Thank you, Stuart, for a bit of a directional focus within visual narrative as we move forward to sort of think about. Sorry, sorry.
Right, I had a few issues.
Yeah, that's bound to happen. So thank you, Stuart, for a bit of a directional focus on thinking about visual narrative as we move forward in the process of drawing, working within visual narrative, within design, within service design, within how we can start to democratize the process and perhaps decolonize the process of thinking about storytelling as a way of moving forward, and having a being able to help and assist other people visualize and communicate the complexities of maybe their disciplines, but also the complexity of how drawings communicate, and maybe how writing has dominated that explanation of the process for thinking about the power of drawing and its possibilities for communicating across language barriers, perhaps, or with, as you rightly sort of said, doing research with Indigenous communities rather than and with them in that case study that you represented.
Yeah, not on them.
And not on them as we as we want to move forward. You presented a range of really great case studies, not only happening within the academy and your particular institution, but things that are probably resonating with a lot of the people watching and attending this particular talk as they engage with other areas of not only business but other areas of their institutions, and thinking about how students come in with that sense of inhibition, and perhaps the clients or perhaps the people that you're doing research with, and how we can sort of use visual narrative particularly to help communicate how to tell stories and how story is so important in whatever we're talking about. I really love the example of the comics contract. I think that's pretty amazing concept that those disciplines and that the particularly conservative disciplines can start to move to using visual narrative and visualizations as a way of communicating effectively with people that have complex ways of thinking about legalese.
That's been the real eye opener to me. Is like that never would have occurred to me that this is something we could do as graphic designers or comics artists. Yeah. We were approached by the lawyers, to say we think we need this, and we don't know who's the right person to approach, but you guys can draw, so you can give us some advice on it.
Yeah.
So it was a shock, really.
Yeah, I think you presented some really great examples of how to unpack that in the beginning for students so they can work towards that and build their own passion for creative practice into something that communicates, rather than perhaps maybe just our understanding of creative arts and our art on design illustration focus, but starting to also see how students would transition, and you can build a festival around that process, and you can start to exhibit their passion but direct it in a way that helps other people communicate, and lawyers and other parts of, you know, perhaps the medical industry as well is another area that's starting to burgeon in this space. I know here in Newcastle we've got some collaborations with NIB that have used these sorts of strategies and drawings in the past as well. So it's kind of a fascinating area of investigation, and I'm really looking forward to your discussion with Alan as well shortly, which will be great. So thank you for doing the keynote this morning. And what we're going to do is take a little bit of a short break now as we move forward. So for people watching via the webinar link, make sure that you can jump into the next webinar. We're going to begin that at around 10:30 on the dot, to give a bit of an introduction to Stuart and Alan in this case. But yeah, so hopefully a couple of those great ideas around how thinking about drawing works, and particularly in a design focus and service design focus, and that shift as we move forward into this millennia, essentially, how we're changing in thinking. So thanks so much, Stuart, for that this morning, and we'll jump into the next webinar at 10:30.
Thanks, Harry.
No worries. Thank you, Stuart.
Bye.
Well, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for everyone's attendance all over the world. My name is Professor Mario Minichiello. I work in the creative industries here, and it's my pleasure to, first of all, thank Stuart for the wonderful journey that we've taken through the way that the creative industries in Australia and in your particular academy is starting to use drawing as really in different ways and as a different tool. And I think there's three elements here before I introduce Alan Mayle. We have a very timely discussion here. I think it's timely because so much is now changing, not simply because of the technology drives so much change, but also because of the attitudes that are now prevailing, having spent quite a while now our disciplines in the traditional academy. And so we're finding that basically drawing is a tool that has great agency, has not just the agency that it's had in the past, which is to render things into its historical formats, the things that we've done in the past and how we can reflect on the power of drawing and creativity and narrative drawing and capture it in frames and capture it in museums, but how it's being used as a future tool through narrative to predict some of the future uncertainties and some of the chaotic future that we're going into. This is really important because the second element is that we are in an academy that is both traditional around the world, but also really increasingly corporatized and monetized. We had an advisory group here that advises the Australian government when commenting on the future of the academy and students making choices to come to university, that it was the same choice as buying a toaster. We know that education is not like buying an object or a toaster. It's about becoming a fully functioning human. It's about self-actuating and finding your way forward. So it's really important that we have these kind of discussions about these new tools that not just affect how we do things outside of ourselves, but how we do things inside. And I think the academy that we're all in is concerned with STEM And STEM is very good at understanding the outside world, whereas art and design and creativity is about discovering our interior selves and being able to speculate the future of not simply business and law or science or biology, but actually about humanity and what it is to be humans into the future. And that, I think, is the third element that we're looking in this discussion, which is this unique capacity that humans have beyond any other species to actually imagine things that don't exist. Not just things, but also experiences and stories that don't exist. We make things up, and in that making things up, that makes us unique as a species, partly because we have such a massive brain. Our brain is some kind of biological accident, and we are actually out of proportion to anything else, any other species on Earth. And in that brain, which is a massive thing that takes up 10% of our energy, 10% of our energy is just ticking over our brain, we have this thing called a mind. And inside the mind, there's this quite extraordinary thing which enables us to imagine. And in the parlance of today, that would be something that is a virtual space, because that's the kind of parlance of the day. In the past, it would have been called spiritual or ethereal, but it's invisible. And in that invisible space that we create from the physical brain, we do things that are to do with imagination and creativity. That makes us unique. And it makes this really a very interesting prospect for an academy that is often finds it very difficult to be able to frame what we do. So this is, again, an extremely interesting discussion. So to continue with this discussion, and I would like everybody please to, there is, as you will see as we go on, there is a space bar for you to put questions as part of the discussion as we go through this. I'd like to introduce the person charged with chairing this discussion, and a great friend of mine and well known around the world, the wonderful Professor Alan Mayle, who is also a conjoint professor at the University of Newcastle in the creative industries, which we're very proud about. Alan is an unbelievable illustrator, writer, and academic. He has directed the illustration program at Falmouth for over 20 years and led it to incredible international success, distinctiveness of its excellence in the provision that it gives the world. He was promoted to professor in 2009, has given many keynotes internationally. He is an authority on communication and cultural skills, professional practice, science and knowledge bearing illustration. He contributes widely to debates in a range of journals and conferences, magazines and learned papers. Professor Mayle, as well as all that, has been the author of a number of books, theoretical contextual perspectives on illustration, 2007 to 2017. The celebrated book in 2014, Meeting the Brief, and the Power of Influence, the Power and Influence of Illustration, which was published in 2019, which is a highly recommended text and is published worldwide and used throughout the world, and has some excellent chapters, particularly one by me. Alan is the editor of a comparison of theoretical illustration benchmark volume. Alan is also an inquisitive person who, I think, really his love of learning has allowed him to contribute to over 170 books and other publications. He has won numerous awards, including Gold from the Society of Illustrators in Los Angeles. These are absolutely outstanding awards, and the Texas Blue Bonnet for children's books. He has exhibited internationally. He has really ploughed the entire breadth of the creative industries, and will lead now this Q&A and encourage people to join in with Stuart now. So, ladies and gentlemen, fellow illustrators and non-illustrators, I give you the wonderful Alan Mayle.
Thanks, Mario. Thank you very much for that. Was that really all me? Well, anyway. So I'm going to move on to Stuart. Stuart, are you there?
I'm here, Alan.
Yeah.
How are you going?
You're there. Yeah,
Good.
well done. Well, anyway, thank you for that incredibly incisive and interesting keynote. And I'm sure that we can extrapolate a considerable amount of material to discuss. But the first thing that I want to cover with you, actually, if that's okay, You were talking about the lament of art and design schools, in art and design schools, and the design industry, about the fact that you know, they don't think that there's anywhere near enough drawing being taught.
Yeah.
And I just, in a general sort of sense, because I like this discussion to sort of broaden out, if you like, in a way, you know, and just briefly talk about the provision afforded by institutions for the teaching of drawings generally. Now, there may be some sort of difference between what it is here in the UK and Australia. I've become quite familiar with how it is in Australia, obviously being a conjoint professor at Newcastle.
Yeah.
But I think there are some similarities. But I think that what we need to do, though, is just look a little bit back at at history, because if we went back to the 60s and then prior to that, I don't think anybody would have complained about you know, the actual provision that art schools provided for drawing practice, you know. And this just goes to show how old I am. I went to art school in the late 60s, right? And in the UK, we used to have what we called municipal art schools. I mean, they were discrete, sort of independent institutions that practically every town, city, county had. Along with their teacher training colleges and technical schools. And of course, they were all born out of the arts and crafts movement. But then in the 70s and 80s in the UK, we had the development and introduction of the polytechnics and the new university sector, who then actually took over the art schools themselves became just mere departments within these larger institutions. But what we've noticed is, to a large extent, is that the senior management in these institutions, they don't seem to have any of the sort of respect that one would expect from people that are running those places. And it seems as if we're fighting a losing battle. I mean, how do you feel about that? I mean, and sort of in an anecdotal sense, what's it like at Edith Cowan?
Yeah, it's okay in my school, because the head of our school, which is the biggest school in the university, is from the Chelsea School of Art. He went through with Edoardo Palazzi, and he's got a sculpture and printmaking background. So he fights the good fight on our behalf, which is nice. And so we can get away with, for example, having a dedicated drawing unit in first year for the visual arts majors. And I can also have one for the design majors. And students can do both if they so desire. And I've worked closely with the scholar that runs the visual arts drawing course to make sure we're not overlapping too much. So that's good. I'm not sure if it's quite so good at some of the other institutions in this town. There's 5 universities in Perth. We're quite overserviced in many ways with universities. And as I tell my colleagues, when things get bad in Edith Cowan, you know they've already been bad in all the other institutions, because we're small beer all round. So we tend to go under the radar of lots of big national decisions about staffing and budgets and so forth. So when things get bad with us, you know they're worse elsewhere. So because we don't have as much skin in the game for international students, for example.
No.
So, you know, with the COVID thing, that's really hit some of the other universities in town super heavily, and we got off relatively scot-free. And years ago, during the global financial crisis, which was just before my time in academia, I know that Edith Cowan also were not the kind of university to gamble half of their earnings on the money market, so they got off lightly as well. So they have a slightly less economically rationalist mindset in the executive than other universities, I think.
Yeah, well, here in the UK, we have been used to over the past few years in a massive increase in our student numbers. We've had to recruit considerably far more than we did, just 10, 15 years ago. And as far as teaching, a practical, a sort of discipline like drawing, for example, that's impacted quite a lot on the pedagogical aspects of how we sort of deliver. The old sitting with Nelly sort of way of teaching, particularly drawing and illustration and so on, it has now gone. And so we've had to think very, very carefully about how we sort of deliver, and in a meaningful sort of way. If you're confronted with a cohort of 120 students, and it's in the syllabus, for example, that they have to be taught drawing, even if it's just one day a week, how does one sort of facilitate that? And how many numbers do you have to deal with? And
yeah, exactly. This is one of the things we are fighting for constantly, I guess, is that maintaining studio space with less than 25 students in the studio. Because the big shift in the last few years has been to have massive cohorts in the first year units. So what they're trying to do is kind of internationalize the first year course. And that online discussion I mentioned with my colleague in the English department, that was part of that course. And the intention for running that course this year was they were going to have between 180 and 300 people in a room for every class. And of course, it was going to be run in a lecture theatre, and they were going to run the lectures for 2 hours.
Right.
And of course, the instruction from the teaching and learning gurus was, well, you have to make it interactive, as if the architecture had no bearing on whether you could be interactive in that space, that's designed to direct the gaze of everybody at this one individual down the front. So, of course, the plan came quickly unstuck because we had to go online because of COVID. And so now we have these shorter lectures, and they're not interactive, but this is what my colleague Deborah Dudek and myself have tried to do, is kind of have these conversations as our lecture spots, where we can talk about what we have in common around things like storytelling. But yeah, it's not ideal. And so it's only really from second year onwards that students can really dedicate themselves in a studio space. And so I think you miss some of it. And at the same time, we're getting pinged for like high attrition rates. Why are you losing students in first year?
Yeah.
It's your course's fault. So, well, they don't get a chance to do the thing they signed up for until second year.
No.
Yeah.
Just moving on a little bit. You talked a lot about the service industries, and that's a principal focus of your interest. With developing the comics and the narrative sort of forms of illustration that you're working with. And also, I've noticed that you've quoted before, that nowadays the sort of the economic basis of Western industrial nations, it actually comprises 60 to 70% of service industries. And of course, we all know that the creative industries and the communications industries are now really huge and impact a great deal on the economies of various countries around the world, particularly in the Western world, as we sort of know it. But because of the global nature of what we do, and I noticed that the work that you were showing was principally, sort of couched in Western Australia, if you like, which is fine. And I was going to ask if any of your work or any of your students think in a more global sort of way, but if they do, you know, we have to be mindful of an increasing awareness, you know, required for sort of global societal and cultural sort of differences. Does that come to play with you, and have you had to think a lot about that when you're teaching and the way in which you grow and develop your curriculum?
Yeah, definitely. I think the change in our curriculum was really based on having access to the Design Institute of Australia's practice notes. And what they were telling us was that design institutions were producing 5 times more graduates than there were kind of traditional studio positions. I don't think the DIA, you know, really has a great handle on what's going on in terms of in-house designers or freelancing and so forth. I mean, how can they? It's a very difficult question to get your head around. But because those opportunities weren't really there for the number of graduates we were producing, we were trying to work more to create students that could work with local councils, with NGOs, etc. Work, you know, to help them kind of solve problems. And one of the things we thought of with the kind of classic studio position is that they would be competing on a global stage. So if clients were looking for these discrete problem solving students, they'd be looking all over the world. If you know that you need a poster, that's the answer to your communication problem. Why pay a fortune locally when you can get it done overseas for next to nothing? So we were trying to produce students that could work on more complex problems because we figured that those are kind of too difficult to do long distance, and you need kind of local interaction. If you've got to work with 20 people involved on this problem, you need to be on the ground with those people. And so that's really been the focus, is trying to create students that work locally or have a local mindset. And if they want to work locally overseas, hopefully we're still giving them the skills to do that. But we're not really trying to produce students that are knocking off a $10 logo or music packaging design like I do for international clients, but no money at all.
The other thing too that I've noticed that you've said that, and I'm assuming that this is part of your sort of experience, that students have been directed away from the humanities.
Sorry, say again.
That students have been directed away from the humanities.
Yeah.
Can you expand a little bit more on that? Because it's interesting, because you know, some of what you were talking about earlier, you seem to be integrating quite a lot with other disciplines, even within your university. I mean, you said that a close friend of yours, an associate, was an English teacher.
Yeah.
And I can't remember, and lawyers and various other things. So if your students are engaging in this sort of way, then one would assume that they're going to become very knowledgeable of those subjects and those disciplines, and have a lot of insight into it. So so you could say that they're starting to become more sort of polymathic in the way in which they think and the way in which they approach.
Definitely.
But you know, I'm just a little bit confused about this business with the humanities, because, you know, like at Falmouth, which is my institution, we integrate liberal studies and contextual studies very much with illustration practice.
Yeah.
And very much part and parcel of what we do is to ensure that the students not only can communicate verbally, but that they do so in writing. And I mean, is that something that you encourage?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. this is part of the idea that Deborah in English and myself had, is that everybody should draw and everybody should write. And this has been, you know, I think when I was talking about that narrative turn and visual turn at the start of my talk, I had in mind that kind of string of theories that once upon a time were thought to belong to, you know, acts of speech or of writing, such as rhetoric or metaphor. And of course, now we know through the work of Lakoff and Johnson, or through, you know, Richard Buchanan in design and Guy Bonsiep and the Swiss Design Network, that rhetoric is just a function of mind, like narrative is, and it can
absolutely
be expressed in any medium. I think the thing that was on my mind when I was talking to you earlier was that idea that well, our Australian government policy anyway at the moment seems to be aimed at trying to direct students away from the humanities, and making the courses more expensive, which of course, you know, perversely makes them more attractive to the universities to run them.
Well, of course. Well, it would.
But I was reading about Agassiz, the American Naturalist. I think you're probably familiar with his work. And some of his writings from the middle of the 19th century, where he was complaining that there wasn't enough studio time and students were being discouraged from drawing, and the sciences weren't being taken seriously in the academy.
Oh, right.
And I thought, this all sounds painfully familiar. So it's incredible, isn't it? That STEM
it is.
Back then wasn't, well, at least the science side of it wasn't taken seriously. It was too practical a subject, perhaps.
Yes. And maybe not seen as intellectually
that's right.
sound enough.
Exactly. Too much learning through doing.
Yeah. But staying with the drawing and the writing, the literary aspect of this, it's interesting to sort of to note that, and this is particularly prevalent in the UK, that in publishing, about 50% now of children's picture books and chapter books are actually written and illustrated by the same person, and that publishers actually encourage that, because they feel that they're just, obviously they're dealing with one person, and it's the complete package. And it's something that, I mean, about 15 years ago, I introduced creative writing onto my illustration course, and the two ran very, very closely together, and the writing side impacted very much on the illustration side.
Absolutely.
I mean, and with your comic book work, do you sort of encourage that sort of approach, almost like graphic noveling and so on?
Yeah, we have an artist's book project that we do with the head of visual arts, myself as the head of design, and one of the writers from the creative writing course. All three of us get together and we give kind of weird takes on the same prompt to the students, and then they go away and work on artist books. So bringing poetry into the visual realm and responding to words visually, or responding visually to the words, but also thinking about the tactile aspect of the materials they're working with. And as I was alluding to in the talk, thinking about this, the kind of affordances of material objects to reveal the narrative as you go through, and to kind of suspend, create suspense through physical materials. You emphasize, your push and the way in which you're developing the narrative aspect of drawing and illustration. What might this change about the way drawing is taught, or don't you think it will be? Well, I think you know, there's still value in the observational, but maybe traditionally there's, from my way of thinking, there's been maybe too much value placed on observation. You know, as Mario was talking about before, the imagination, you know, as kind of creative industries, creative people, creative scholars, we're very interested in the inside world, the interior world.
Yes.
And to me, illustration always, even at the most mundane level, always has this metaphoric attribute. So if a metaphor is there to make the ungraspable into a concrete, knowable thing, that's the role, in my mind, that's the key role for drawing, is to bring out something, an idea, and to make it physical on the page. So that's, and I think that's the thing that changes through narrative drawing, is an emphasis on that idea and an emphasis on explaining that idea through a story. So therefore, each drawing becomes kind of less important, but more kind of, you know, like bricks in a wall, if you like, rather than focusing on the individual brick.
Yeah, it's also interesting that a lot of the work that you showed, it was very representational, and in a sense quite traditional in a sort of a graphic novel narrative sort of comic book sort of style, if you like. And it's interesting that a lot of applicants to the UK undergraduate illustration programs, this is across the whole country, very often only see illustration itself in terms of graphic noveling. I don't know if that's something that you've come across, and don't seem to be familiar with any other forms of illustration, whatever that might be. But I mean, there's a paradox here for me, because, you know, in order to do graphic novels, or even some of the sort of work that you're advocating and that you're producing with yourself or with your students, you know, you have to draw superbly well, you know, in terms of, you know, putting together dramatic compositions and visual interactions and, you know, human gesture and expression and so on. And a lot of that is born out of pure observation, you know, which I have to actually say, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to approach it in a subjective manner. You know, I mean, like if we went back to the days of Leonardo, when we're looking at just it's very ontological in the way in which they approach their work. You know, what you saw was what was it. You know, you didn't need to think or analyze anything more than what it was, the morphological aspects of the subject. But so when it comes to teaching students today, you know, you're encouraging them to develop the narrative ways in which that you want them to go in. Do you not feel that perhaps you know, students should be actually drawing more in that sort of traditional sort of objective sort of way?
I think there's definitely something to be had in a focus on that, at least at the beginning, as you say, for, you know, observational purposes, in order to then be able to boil that down to the essence of, you know, cartooning, which still contains all these kind of very realistic gestures and so forth.
Yes.
But the problem becomes kind of equating visual realism with truth, or with truthiness.
Yes.
When something that's completely abstract that you can draw, you can make visible on the page, let's say like a family tree diagram, or a corporate structure diagram. Now you made that thing visible. You can't go out in the world and draw that. You can't draw that as, you know, as a kind of copy off what you see. And it's important, and it's truthful, and you make it visual through this kind of metaphoric process. And that's not about observation of what's outside. It's about observing thoughts and knowledge inside somehow, and making a connection to something that maybe you've seen in the real world. I don't know, but
yeah. But I've always said, and I've actually written about this, that with the aspects of objective and analytical drawing, there are three ways in which you can go. There is the ontological truth sort of approach, and you've just described what I've talked about before is the phenomenological truths. You're talking about processes and phenomena that we know exist, right? But they're abstract sort of notions. We can't see them, like the theory of evolution, for example. Photosynthesis, from a scientific point of view. But there's also another one as well. And now we're getting more into the realms of sort of religion, mythology, and culture, and that's fantasy, where perhaps people will sort of deflect away from pure ontological sort of work because of some sort of cultural diktat or some religious belief that they feel that they have to represent something more in that sort of field because of censorship or because of various other things where they would be castigated for actually producing that sort of work. It leads us into some very interesting areas, I think.
The veiled critique.
The veiled critique, yes. But very much so. So
it's very interesting that you raise actually the fantasy thing, and I think the same holds true for science fiction as well, something that doesn't exist.
Yes.
But both of those registers, if you like, those modes, can perversely benefit from a very realistic kind of rendering, can't they?
Oh, absolutely.
In order to suspend
I think
the audience. Or...
I think you can produce an illustration or an image in a very representational and, as you say, realistic sort of way, but it can be unbelievably creative. For me, it's what you do and say with the image. And that's where the imagination sort of comes from it. And to me, I think drawing is the way in which a lot of that process of thinking can be externalized and then sort of developed. And I also think that, like, sort of taking inspiration and developing that into some sort of creative idea isn't something that can be done by rote. You can't sort of teach it and say, well, you've got to start looking at that bit and then moving on to here. It has to be much more spontaneous and so on. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to return to Agassi, it was quite interesting to look at his classroom prompts and how light they were on detail.
Yes.
And the students that came up through that course were, would often complain about having almost no instruction, but they found themselves, just having to figure it out and kind of growing this extra brainal node just to deal with observation.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Well, I always used to say to the students that sort of drawing, in a sense, was like a process of search and change.
Yeah.
Because and it's always best when it's free. When you're doing the drawing, that you're sort of free from the sort of the formality or constraints of having to use preconceived media or some expected visual language which you're trying to push, or just to allow the whole thing to develop sort of naturally and see where you sort of go. And I always think that's a very good way to sort of proceed.
Yeah.
But I've always been more concerned with content and what the illustration's doing and saying, rather than to obsess over media and the visual language itself. To me, that should just come naturally anyway. I mean, I don't know how you feel about that. I mean, if say, for example, if you had a student, because most of the work that you showed, there was quite a defined sort of style flowing through most of it.
Yeah, well, most of that was in that kind of narrative mode for service design.
Yes.
So it was a little bit samey. I think I was just trying to amplify that idea of making multiple pictures with kind of relatively low stakes. But I think to go back to what you were saying about representation of, things out there versus making visible things in here, that's definitely a big part of it for us, for the students, is to discover how they each draw.
Yeah.
And how it feels to make marks for them, and how you kind of start to develop a style of picturing that's your own. And to me, that's completely tied in with what media you gravitate towards.
Yes.
The rough feel of a pencil on toothy paper versus smooth gliding of a brush on hammer mill or something with ink. Totally about the same process. The way you make the marks and the media you gravitate towards, I think, should come naturally with practice.
Yeah. I suppose, in a sense, I know that one of the later on in this symposium, one of the breakout groups is going to be talking about traditional ways of working versus the new technologies and the digital sort of aspects of producing work. I mean, you've just alluded to very much that sort of the physical tangency that we have with real media and so on, the sensuality of it, I suppose, to a certain extent. Well, where do you sort of stand on that particular sort of?
Yeah, I definitely, I was a person that was a latecomer to design, and by the time I studied it, the digital tools had been introduced, and so my first couple of graphic design jobs were physical paste up jobs.
Oh, right,
only for the first couple of months, and then I embraced the digital tools with gusto, and it's only over years that I've kind of worked my way back to being an old curmudgeon and really enjoying the physical stuff. But I'm really fried today because we had a huge day yesterday in the print room with the design students, the design first years, and for most of them, it was their first time getting ink under their nails and making monoprints, and they had a ball. We couldn't get them out of the room.
I bet.
So it was almost like, to them, this old media is new media. It's like it's like having a fixie bicycle or homemade pie or something. It feels authentic to them, I think, as an experience. So I hold out a lot of hope that they will kind of embrace that and go back there to use it. I think it's important.
Just moving into a slightly different area now. You talk about narrative, and I mean you see that as being very much part of illustration in a big way. And I always see narrative as a sort of when we're talking about sequential work, or where it's dealing with a chronology of some sort or other. But for me, there are 5 contexts of illustration practice fundamentally, and I think that you can apply narrative to all 5 in a visual sense, even to even an advertising campaign. Tells a story, doesn't it? Very often it's a narrative, and it's sequential. And most sort of aspects of information illustration, or those images that actually convey knowledge or educate us in some sort of way, a lot of that is very, very narrative in the way in which it's sort of produced. The non-fiction side of things. because a lot of people seem to think that narrative illustrations is purely fictional stuff.
Yeah.
But I see it as going across all five of those contexts, you know, which is like editorial, information, advertising, and then you have the packaging and marketing side of work.
Yeah.
And you can apply it to all of them. But by saying that, do you encourage broader contexts of practice to come into your line of work and into your teaching? You know, do you touch on advertising? Do you touch on sort of knowledge-based material or
yeah, absolutely. So my other hat when I'm not working in the academy is I run a record label with a couple of friends, and we make a living for one of our partners and also for a lot of our artists through licensing, basically. Yeah. So we sell a lot of music sell licenses for music to advertising.
Yeah.
And to documentary making and so forth. So there's a focus on that, and quite often we get students involved in some of those projects as well. So the idea of an advertising campaign being a narrative and going across media is definitely front of mind when we're kind of setting those projects up for them. I think, like, to get back to the materials discussion, I think that comes into it as well. So you mentioned packaging design. Yeah. That can totally be a narrative experience, you know, that difference between what you see on the front of the package.
Yes.
And what happens when you open it up, you know, how does it change? How does it, you know, support your expectations or subvert them in a surprising and exciting way? So that kind of lovely gameplay that you learn through, the students learn through making with materials, how to control, I think, the material experience of the customer of that product or whatever. Yeah, and it could be like, you know, really like a micro narrative, really, but still a narrative nonetheless. It's a kind of a time-based experience where something changes. A tiny little story is told, fiction or non-fiction.
Do you place a lot of emphasis on, you know, when you're teaching and when students are engaged with project work? You know, whether they're working on a brief, whatever that might be, do you place a lot of emphasis on making sure that they understand who the target audience is, and are they taught about that? Is there some sort of integrated part of your teaching which looks at lots of different types of audiences, you know, from narrow focused audiences to a broad global audience, for example? Is that covered?
Yeah, absolutely.
And do you think that the way in which we draw can affect that? You know, I mean, for example, if you're producing something, some visual imagery that's for somebody to say that's going to be marketed worldwide, would that impact very much on how your students approach the work or what?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were involved with a research project with David Skopek at the UDK in Berlin to try and reimagine the toilet pictograms for different cultures, for example. Yes. So very focused and, you know, kind of seemingly simple, discrete little task to redesign these things, but with, you know, incredible implications. So yeah, we look at that on one side, but, you know, these first year courses, I was explaining that everybody in the school has to do, regardless of whether they're doing journalism or English or or politics or whatever. They have a focus in there about, you know, writing for particular audiences, communicating visually to particular audiences, and then we'll pick up that thread when the students come to us for their major.
Yeah.
But we also want to open it up to the idea of, like, who are you as an illustrator, as a draftsperson, as a designer? Are you a neutral conduit for your client's message? and you can tell them what's appropriate for that audience or whatever, or you can discuss that together. Or are you a part author or the entire author of that message, you know, in which case, what kind of license does that open up to you to just kind of communicate what you feel and to let people embrace it or not, you know, on your terms. So all kind of points in between those. We have a unit called "What is Design For?" ? Which kind of opens up all these things and opens up that question of having a personal philosophy about what you think visual communication is for.
And is there, do you have a defined answer that you expect them to come up with, or,
no,
or is it open-ended?
Certainly not.
It's open-ended.
Yeah, in the same way that I wouldn't tell them how to draw. I want them to discover who they are.
Yeah.
We'll give them, you know, some strategies to maybe go and explore in different directions. And I think that's the same. You know, you can't. I would hate to think you would tell somebody what philosophy they should adopt.
So do you encourage that sort of authorial approach to illustration, where, you know, the illustrator has creative ownership and control over what it is that they actually do, without being too prescribed in any sort of given way?
Well, I certainly encourage them to look at it. But I know that, you know, 3/4 of our students are absolutely horrified by the idea of inventing a narrative themselves or inventing a problem. They would much rather have the rules of the game laid out and to play, you know, be playful within those parameters. That seems to be the majority of our students. Others embrace it with gusto, but most would like to be given the strict parameters of this particular brief and work within it. They freak out a bit if they don't have the boundaries. But the sort of work that they actually produce at the end, does it look, or have they, you know, the sort of methods that they use to produce that work, has it restricted them, do you think, very much? I mean, are they really sort of, in terms of what's going on in their head, contained within a sort of a box? And what is it that they're afraid to get out of? I think they're not so much afraid to explore, but they want to have a starting point. I think they don't want to be dropped in the middle of the ocean. They'd rather be, you know, to use a kind of a Dungeons and Dragons kind of analogy, like you awaken in a dark dungeon, and at least they know where they are. Then, you know, they get a sense of they need to get out or something. Whereas, you know, they're not just wandering in a desert of you know, lack of ideas or prompts. But the work that comes out is, you know, substantially different from student to student, noticeably different, which is always gratifying.
Yeah, I mean, do your students engage in a lot of location work, reportage, and so on? And if they do, I mean, are they encouraged to be expressive with that sort of work, or to be much more sort of descriptive?
Yeah, well, not reportage per se, but we encourage them when we're working on projects with clients that they're recording the discussions visually, and so they can use direct references from that those meetings in the final design. And especially around service design, there's, you know, for our students, we do a lot of work in that area. And the first run of it will be at this very chicken scratchy kind of level. On the one hand, because it's a function of working very quickly to record what's being said and the gestures and so forth. But on the other hand, it's at that level so that when we present the ideas back to the client and back to the client's customers or whatever, clients in the case of somebody like Anglicare or, you know, Centre for Social Impact. You want to encourage that interaction from their users. And if the thing looks, you know, too stylized or too pushed in one direction or too slick, then quite often the response will be, oh, it's great. Yeah. And that's all you'll get from them. It's fine, no problem. Whereas if it's very sketchy and open, they'll buy into it, and then they'll add sketches to it and so on, which we encourage them to do. And then as we proceed, depending on where that service gets to and what the client needs to do in terms to get the service funded and up and running, they might have to prepare it as kind of something that looks like a fait accompli to their bean counters, in which case our students would then be encouraged to kind of, you know, stylize it and put their heart and soul into the finished narrative, visual narrative.
Yeah. Do you find that a lot of students, particularly at undergraduate level, though, are, you know, quite influenced by certain sort of styles of illustration or certain contexts of practice? I'm thinking in terms of things like sort of manga, which has been, you know, I believe it still is very popular. You know, it has been in the UK, for example. You know, you interview prospective students, and some of them would have portfolios full of sort of manga drawings, not very good, I have to say. But I mean, I don't know what your view is on that.
I'm going to say here, like I would definitely see that maybe 10 years ago. And I think we've had a really wonderful and rich explosion in even a splintering, if you like, of illustration styles. Illustration was not a big deal here until the early 2000s. And then suddenly you started to see it in all the latest magazines. Yes. And of course, early on, it had a very, you know, Flash website kind of look to it, very vector graphics. It wasn't long before people were getting back into that kind of handmade style. And I think now, like musical tastes, it's so splintered. Occasionally you get, you know, the kind of Adventure Time, the Pendleton Ward kind of aesthetic, but mostly there's quite a variety there, I think. This is one of the things that I found interesting reading Neil Cohn's work about, you know, the grammar of comics and so on. And he actually laments that we don't have a strong visual vocabulary like the Japanese do in the West. And I was thinking, well, I think that's a great thing that we don't. I think it's great that we have this kind of variety of expression, that people are, you know, bringing forth their body felt kind of responses to what they feel and know about the world when they draw, rather than an accepted kind of off the rack approach. Maybe I don't have the eyes to see the subtle differences within manga. There's probably a lot more there than I've given it credit for.
Can I sort of up the ante a little bit now and just move up a gear from, say, because we've talked a lot about undergraduate, you know, the undergraduate student experience, which is to be expected, because that's where the majority of the teaching lies, because at the end of the day, this is about drawing in the academy, so you'd expect that. But if we can just talk briefly, I don't know how much longer we've got, but if we can just talk briefly a little bit about research and where drawing sort of lies with that. You know, I mean, I don't know what your view is when you peer review sort of research papers that are, you know, ostensibly to do with drawing or visual sort of work. How much do you think that those papers or that research is where the visual work you see is research led, or whether or not you're just looking at something which is just research informed. So it's a more superficial sort of approach to using it. Well, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think it's noticeable, definitely. I think there are a lot of scholars out there that are reporting on what they see. For example, on a scholarly review of a graphic novel, of an important graphic novel, for example, that the artist chose to work in this way, in this size book for these reasons. And you think, well, actually, there are a whole bunch of constraints probably from the publisher that you don't know about because you don't work as an illustrator. There's the physical constraints of the artist's own musculature, you know, that they're not referring to, as if this artist has just adopted that style just to tell that story. It may be that the story and the style coincide in really nice, harmonious ways, and that's why this is such a successful book. But that artist is going to work in that way, you know, and I read a lot of scholarly work at that level where they're observing it as if these are very careful and deliberate choices that maybe they're not, or maybe they were out of the control of the author. And I think it would be really nice, like I mentioned before, that kind of conversation that my English colleague and I have in front of the undergraduate students. It'd be nice to see a lot more scholarship between, let's say, narratologists and makers.
Yes.
In Australia, I don't know if you have this problem in England, but you know, our creative outputs as research are always called non-traditional research outputs.
Yes.
You know, as if they're kind of, there's the proper ones and then there's these non-traditional ones.
Yeah,
and maybe a way to get around that would be for us makers to work a bit more closely with writers, and then we could pull them up on these points of order and say, well, actually, the reason it looks like that is because whatever.
Well, I mean, I have to say, as an anecdote and as an aside, I mean, you're talking about working with you know, your colleague who's English, but I mean, when I did my PhD all those years ago, and I first embarked on research in the context that we're talking about now, I worked with scientists, and that was an interesting experience, I can tell you, because I remember the first time that I part wrote in conjunction with these scientists. Well, it was a joint paper. It was three of us, two scientists and me. But I was seen as an equal anyway, and participated. But when we went to the conference and we had to present ourselves, and you can imagine what some of these scientists, particularly from the United States, were like. I mean, they don't hold any punches. You know, they go straight for the jugular, as you can probably imagine, and they say things like, "Well, why have you done it that color?"
Yeah,
you know. And then you suddenly think to yourself, now, why did I do it that color?
Yeah, right.
And it's an interesting concept, isn't it? This and
but versus explicit knowledge.
Oh, absolutely, yes, yeah. But do you think that drawing can manifest purely as research?
Yeah, I have no doubt. I think, as I was saying in the talk, I think it hasn't helped growing up in an Anglophone culture where, you know, words are held in this regard and pictures are down here. And you have all these assumptions about what each is good for. I think there are endless possibilities that we haven't even explored yet. I imagine a day where there's a purely visual PhD, and I'm not talking about like Nick Susanus's unflattening, which always gets brought up at these points, but like strictly pictorial. I don't see why that's not a possibility. It's a pretty outlandish one, but I think it could be feasible.
Yeah. Right. Well, I must confess, I don't have any more sort of hard questions.
Can I ask you one, Alan?
That's been great. Yeah, please do. Yeah.
About the working with the scientists, because I'm sure it's something you told me years ago, I'm not even sure how to phrase this, but it was something about how when you're drawing, let's say, a species of fish,
Yes.
that you're not drawing necessarily the one that's sitting in front of you. You're trying to draw the quintessential yellowfin tuna, for example. So I just wonder, is that correct? And how do you go about trying to make an amalgam of all the yellowfin tuna you've ever met? How does that sit with, like, you know, pure representation versus something else, something you know about a species or whatever? Is that
I think
question?
No, it's a very good question, actually. And I think the answer I would give is it depends very much on what the requirement is and why you're actually doing it.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're talking about a yellowfin tuna, well, if it's just a general sort of illustration of a yellowfin tuna, there's a chance that it's going to be on a page in a book, or, you know, it's going to appear on a website or whatever with other species within the same family. So
Yeah.
you're producing an illustration which is sort of generic to that particular
Right.
species, and it's going to be shown in a classic sort of pose, usually side on, so you can see the shape of the fins. It's just purely for salient view, purely for identification purposes.
Yeah.
But then there's the other side, which the more sensory sort of side, if you like, where you might be illustrating a particular sort of specimen, or a sort of where a species has sort of gone off on its own and developed quirky ways different from others of its own kind, and so you're doing your best there to sort of get into this thing and actually bring out its characterizations and that particular quirkiness. So there are lots of different ways in which you can show this. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier on about the phenomena. It could be the evolution of a species. How do you show that?
Yeah.
Well, then you're moving into the realms perhaps of diagrams and so on.
Yeah.
So it's a very broad field. You know what I mean?
Very rich field. Yeah.
And a very rich field. Yes. Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Alan.
That's all right. I think we have some questions, I believe. Ari, are you there? Oh, maybe not.
Okay, so
here we are.
I'm just gonna sort of help facilitate this next sort of little 15 to 20 minutes as we wrap up. And I just want to thank you both for the discussion. It's been really interesting, and I guess really interesting to see some of the sort of synthesis of ideas from two different people, and I think resonating with other people about the things like manga and things like how drawing within the academy works, both from a tertiary education point of view, but also how it can manifest as research, maybe solely, as you were just discussing then. I've got a couple of questions to ask both of you to pull it back into that education space as we move forward. So, you know, there's lots of research being done about multiple creativities as we move forward, thinking about how creativity and the creative industries, but creativity works and operates in a range of different fields. And you can see now from the keynote from Stuart how drawing is starting to almost move into these other areas like service design that are engaging with law, engaging with you know, other communities perhaps in how we tell stories and visual storytelling works. But the industry and business, community, and all parts of society need these sorts of skills and Australia is currently sitting at 23 on the World Table of Innovation. So how do we start to think about engaging these types of strategies and drawings with external communities to understand how creativity has value within the innovation conversation, which now has nearly been going on for, you know, 20 years, as Stuart said, drawing and illustration becoming prominent here in Australia around about 2000, and we've been having this conversation about creative industries itself, but yeah, how is drawing still relevant in this innovation age and moving away from the buzzword perhaps, but using it as a really strong conceptual strategy for ideas?
I've always said that you can't teach creativity. I mean, I really don't think you can. I mean, I hate to use this sort of simplistic term, but we're all born differently anyway, and we all have particular aptitudes and things that we're good at and not good at. I think that really that good teaching, good pedagogy is being able to bring that creativity out, to enable the student to be able to harness that, and then externalize that through drawings, if that's how it should be. And it doesn't matter what the style is, because as I was saying before, it's all down to what the ideas are and where they're actually coming from. And then also, if it's in a research context, then to apply it to whatever your methodology is, and then pursue that methodology in a creative way.
Yeah,
it's not easy to explain, really, and particularly if you're looking at trying to sort of explain that to a lay audience, because most people, they just think when they hear the term creativity, they think, oh, that's somebody playing a guitar, or they're being clever or whatever. So, I mean, that's where I'm coming from with that.
It's interesting you say that, and I'm going to quote one of the organisers here, Dr. Andrew Howes, where when we started our course on drawing this year, we said we can't teach you to draw. No. We can teach you.
That's right. Yeah.
We can teach you about drawing, we can teach you about techniques, we can teach you about processes, but we can't teach you how to. And it still involves that engagement with tacit knowledge, as Stuart was saying, that sort of master learning the ways by doing, and the importance of that process. Which brings me to another question, which I might direct towards Stuart, and that is, what we see in many, and I'm sure it's similar in the UK and around the world, is we see drawing being so used by children at a young age, and up until perhaps 12 or 13, and it sort of drops off within the curriculum. And then when we come to universities, we are sort of acting as a bit of a remedial centre for that process of it being lost within secondary education, whatever you call that around the globe. And there's sort of this argument for drawing being the big draw, for example, that drawing being so important in perhaps those teen years, and how it can be integrated within secondary curriculum, so that by the time we're arriving in higher education, doing all the sorts of pedagogical practices that we all know and love, should there be more of an emphasis of drawing within the secondary? Do you think, or do you have any reflections on that, Stuart, and your own students that you've seen come through?
For sure. I think I mean, we're all biased, aren't we? Of course, but I think it should continue throughout. A lot of the literature seems to talk about this U-shaped curve, where kids, when they're infants, they're just drawing, as you say, all the time. And then it drops off. And again, maybe this is a function of being in an Anglophone society, where we're weaned off picture books as we grow older. The pictures start to evaporate from the books. So it's not just about lack of encouragement to draw. It's about a lack of kind of drawn input into your kind of daily life, I think. So there's a whole bunch of things conspiring against that. Maybe it creates, good critical readers. I don't know, but I think that skill should be kept there. And maybe to tie that back to your question about creativity, it's such a strange term, but one of the things that I hear much more lately is this idea of capability. And I read a Deloitte's report, as you do. It's pretty riveting reading, but it was about the Toyota plant in one of the cities in Japan. And they found that the guys running the robots on the floor couldn't keep up with the changes necessary in the programming and the software changes, etc., the updates. And what Toyota decided to do was to get these guys working physically, bending metal themselves using old style tools, old lathes and guillotines, etc. And they found that they built up these new capabilities and came up with much better ideas about how the robots could be doing this work, and it totally changed their relationship with their daily work practices, and they seem to become more creative and more invested in what they were doing. So whether that's teaching them creativity or not, I don't know, but it seemed to be increasing their capabilities. And I think what's so important about keeping kids drawing all the time is that physicality. So it's maybe not necessarily just about drawing, but maybe the importance of play, physical play, all the way through, right up into adulthood. Why not? Why aren't we still, climbing on jungle gyms and climbing trees and so forth? If you think about drawing as this kind of metaphoric way of kind of making your place in the world and your relationship to it and your understanding of the relationship of things in the world, making those concrete on the page, then you need to be, physically active in that world. And I think drawing is a much more physical, interactive activity than writing on a computer or reading.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, so another question I've got is, the rhetoric is a foundation of the mind, so to speak, when it comes to speculative thinking. So can we start to use visual rhetoric? And I suppose this plays into the idea of also learning the skills of visual thinking and how to think about composition, as Alan mentioned earlier, learning the technique. And we've got another question on that as well, that, this idea of working conceptually versus having that skill. And that's a lot of the time where a lot of our students are sitting as they come into higher education, especially if we are a remedial sort of center in some senses as well. But how can we start to get them thinking, as many of your case studies in the keynote exemplified, the idea of using, not making it a little too scary to draw these ideas and concepts to begin that process, so that we can start to translate it into speculative thinking, perhaps using it as an ideation, for want of another buzzword, thinking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, is that a question around visual literacy, maybe?
Yeah, well, so David Blakelock from UniSA has also put in a comment around the idea. Around the idea of drawing as a form of language, and I know you both know him, but talking about drawing as a form of language often gets a lot more traction in teaching institutions, particularly, and the value and importance of drawing, and how we justify the processes of teaching and justify it to students, justify it to other colleagues, and given the state of Australian universities at the moment, justify it in the state of the academy, so to speak, when the arts and humanities are sort of diminished. Well, we're having to communicate the importance of this at a time when, it may be diminishing in the academy. So the importance of visual rhetoric and all of this stuff around creative industries. But a question from Mario as well is that how do we get to expand that attention on drawing when we are teaching in much more minimized capacity, perhaps in sessions that are now 1 hour instead of 2, or even less than what they once were in 2000, where people were drawing all day and perhaps all week. How do we start to have this facilitation about that tacit learning of these skills, that getting a level of expertise when these things are shifting and changing within the academy, or have been for some time?
What I was going to say actually is that in some respects this can go back to what we were talking about, or what you were talking about just now, back to very early learning with children, and perhaps what we should be teaching them there is to develop a visual intelligence, so that they know and understand what it is that they're actually looking at when they see an illustration or a drawing or a painting or a photograph even, and actually if that can be instilled within them at an early stage, then it sort of stays with them as they progress, even if they don't necessarily go on to become artists or whatever. I mean, Stuart, you mentioned just now, that as kids go through school, I can't remember the exact words that you used, but that as they look at literature, as they look at books or whatever, the words start to increase and the visual imagery decreases. It starts to evaporate. I think that was the word you used. Well, if we placed equal emphasis on the visual as we do with the words, and sort of had looked at the visual intelligence side of things and tried to encourage that, then I think it would be much better later on. I really do. I had to say that, so I hope that helps.
Yeah. Well, I think Ari, you mentioned visual language. Making kids aware that not just about the act of drawing for themselves, but just seeing visual media out there and how each of those works in relationship to other bits of visual language. There are advertising campaigns, for example, that refer to something that came before that, and they rely on the fact that that they're referring to that visually.
Absolutely. I was going to talk a little bit on and play on the concept that you said around meta narratives and the importance of once something becomes meta, that you start to see it almost being embraced by the population. And that ties into the idea that children now are probably much more adept at being visually mediated with all of the sorts of things involved in their daily experiences and the things that they see and engaging with on iPads for, when things become meta, it seems to be sort of subsumed by society in how drawing and illustration goes. And I do have a question around whether you think that is more complicated to sort of justify drawing and illustration and how that works across all of these different areas of visual communication, in the sense that people are so used to it. Sometimes unpacking the complexity, as you were saying, around metaphor, how people engage with metaphor, or how they engage with the different areas of individual inhibition and technology and social inhibition as well. How those sorts of things are maybe getting more difficult to teach students when they're so used to being and seeing things as well.
Yeah, it's true. I think there's some good work from, I mentioned them before, the Swiss Design Network. I don't know if you've read any of their work, but like Anina Schneller and Anna Scheuermann and those sort of people, they talk about advertising design in that rhetorical sense, that it's trying to persuade you to do something, but then kind of implicit in what they're saying there, they acknowledge that it's persuading you by going above and beyond in some way. So therefore, that acknowledges there's a norm, there's a convention for whatever that field of advertising might be, or that field of packaging design, for example. So if we were to look at something like pharmaceutical design, to take a Swiss example, there's a way those look. You walk into the chemist and everything looks similar, right? It's of a kind. So it'd be extremely easy for a design student to go, well, I can just make something that looks different to that. I can put it in a orange juice container and say, here's your vitamin C pills or something. And yes, it would stand out through that kind of rhetorical flourish, if you like, that visual rhetorical flourish. But would it be trusted in the sense of this convention of, especially in health, where it's all about trust? Those kinds of ideas, I think, are quite easy to grasp and quite easy to teach, and give students really fun opportunities. So yeah, let's go crazy. Let's design something that really fractures the established way of doing something. And then we can look at and try and assess the costs of doing that, the risk of doing that.
Awesome. Well, we've got another comment from Maggie Halls who sort of resonates with the idea that you're both saying that you can't teach creativity, but you can certainly guide it. And I think, having less time to engage with those sorts of things and start to get people to think about visual narrative and maybe the hegemonic or homogenous way that things look and how we can disrupt that process as well is really important as we move forward. One of the questions I will put to you towards the end is starting to sort of think about this within design and art education. What do you think the role of and I know you've both written prolifically around these sorts of things, but the role of, but I've read your book too. It's great. How how visual communication is becoming a much more important part of the future of how we communicate, and the idea that more students within creative industries and outside as well within the academy should be exposed to this, because they are in everyday life as well.
Well, everywhere we go, there's visual imagery. And it didn't used to be quite like that, although I suppose you could argue that if we went back to classical times with the ancient Greeks and the Romans, that, you know, there were mosaics and that there was graffiti and so on around all the place. But nowadays, wherever you go, wherever you look, you're just bombarded with stuff. So I don't think it's difficult to sort of justify what we do in an academic sense by teaching kids this stuff. I'm quite happy with the way things are, and that's probably how I feel right now.
Yep.
Yeah, it's critical thinking with a visual focus, isn't it? Really, that's what's required. I think it's not enough to think, well, we're moving towards a more visual society. Isn't that wonderful? It's like, no, it could be absolutely terrible, and lots of it is. Lots of it's diabolical. So it's our mission, I think, our responsibility to try and give people the critical tools to question that and respond. In our cases, anyway, respond visually to it, in hopefully in a constructive way that makes a better visual environment.
And to question ethics and moral responsibility as well.
Yeah,
because I think that comes a lot into it, in my opinion.
Yeah, I've been sort of talking a lot with students about having a personal philosophy of design, which Stuart's mentioned earlier, and Alan, you have in the concept of the polymath principle as well. The idea of building a sort of a student that is well-rounded in the way that they think about history and philosophy and ethics and values, and how they might be able to materialize that in a drawing process or illustration, or whether that drawing works across UX and service design. So I might just wrap up here as we hit 11:55 and 12 o'clock and whatever hour it is over there in the UK for Alan. And I just wanted to thank you both and for engaging in this discussion. I think it's really important at this time, and given the current year that we've had, and many of us sort of wondering the way that the tertiary education is going to go, and the importance of something like drawing and illustration as we move forward. So I wanted to thank you both for having the conversation, and Stuart for the keynote earlier, and Mario for opening this up, and just to discuss a little bit before we hit the breakout sessions at 12:30. So we're getting a bit of a lunch break for half an hour or so before you can join those links via the DITA website, which you should have sent out to you. So those three different sessions are drawing for illustration and thinking about drawing for illustration, drawing for animation, drawing for design and creative arts. And the facilitators there are going to have a discussion with you and engage you in a bit of a practical workshop in which we'll be doing drawing activities. I know some people may not be able to join those sessions given that they are overseas and it's, you know, a very late hour as well. But I did want to thank you both for joining us and at least prompting this discussion.
Thanks, I think Mario as well.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. Sort of start to the day and great conversations, and great to hear both of your ideas on this and how we can sort of take them into the academy, into our research, and into our practice of teaching as well. So we'll come back again, there's a sort of plenary session to close and have a look at what people did at workshops. And the key thing for this event is to start a dialogue between international and national colleagues about the role of drawing into the future and its importance across all these different things that have been discussed this morning, and it's just been fantastic. So these are the facilitations, just to remember that if you can't get into the Zoom link, and they should all be functional and working, to type in the password DITA to make sure that you can do it. You can also follow us on Twitter at network_drawing, and we'll be communicating out to all the attendees and people who've registered both of these discussions and talks as we move forward, and ways to connect with some of the colleagues via websites, etc. And thanks for joining us before we hit our session. So thank you very much to both of you again for joining us and helping connect this, and thanks to our head of school and the team as well that sort of brought this event together to be able to communicate these key ideas and organize things so that you could come on board in this new virtual fashion that we're all getting very used to. So yeah, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and thanks for asking me. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Larry. Great talking to you again, Alan.
And you, Stuart. Hope to see you soon somewhere in the world.
Yeah, likewise.
Fantastic. Thanks to everyone that's attended. It's been great.
Cheers.